hidden from the madding crowd.
Welcome, everyone. How are you this evening? Glad so many of you could come out tonight. We are in our fourth presentation of our spring series, and we have one more. We hope you'll be able to make it. Wanted to make sure I emphasize that next week's program will be on Tuesday. And it will not be located in Moffett Auditorium. It will actually be in Walnut 101. So make sure you note that. And that's when that's when we could get our speakers, was on that Tuesday. And it's going to be a great presentation. We have Cynthia Kay and Connor Beveridge. They are two faculty members of Wayne Community College, and they're going to discuss the impact of artificial intelligence on today's world. So I think that's going to be an excellent one to attend to, very relevant today, just as Dr. Shu's very relevant today. We're delighted that tonight Dr. Angel Shu is coming all the way from Chapel Hill, from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, to enlighten us on a topic of current importance, and that's U.S. and China's relationship concerning climate change. And she's here tonight because of a long-time, highly valued relationship with Carolina Public Humanities. For decades, we have partnered where Carolina Public Humanities has brought wonderful scholars here to our campus, and tonight is no exception. To introduce her, we have Carolina Public Humanities Executive Director and friend, Max Orr, who has made the trip twice to Goldsboro, and we really appreciate him doing that. We want to thank Stephen Smith for taking care of the lights and sound, and all of the members of the Arts and Humanities Committee, and of course the foundation staff, Emily, Wendy, and Caleb. And we want to thank Dr. Patty Pfeiffer for being such a wonderful president and attending just about every one of our programs. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Max to introduce Dr. Shu.
Thank you, Charlotte. And certainly I know Charlotte was mentioning that I've been here twice this year, but by no means have I only been to this incredible institution twice. I'd say I've been here maybe a dozen times, and to Goldsboro a few times. We have such a wonderful relationship with everyone here. Of course, I want to thank Charlotte for her leadership in this wonderful program, Stephen Smith also for making sure we can all be heard, and Dr. Pfeiffer, who is here. Again, that support is really critical, and so great that you could be here for this event. Members of the foundation, Emily Bird, Caleb Mitchell, and Wendy Potter are all so wonderful in making sure that these programs exist out here in Goldsboro. As I mentioned, we go to community colleges all over the state. There are 58 of them. We've been to probably 26 or so of them so far. Shh, don't tell anyone, but Wayne Community College is the best one, right? I promise I don't say that everywhere, but no. I will say, regardless of whether it's the best one or not, it is certainly the community college we have the closest and tightest and longest relationship with, and it's just really gratifying to be out here with so many of our friends again to be able to work together and present great scholarship to you. I don't want to take too much time for our speaker, so I'm going to get right to it. Dr. Angel Hsu is here. She's Associate Professor of Public Policy and Environment, Ecology and Energy, and is the Director of the Data-Driven EnviroLab and the Center for Resilient Communities and Environmental Scholarship. She has a BS in Biology and a BA in Political Science from Wake Forest. Has a Master's in Philosophy for Environmental Policy from Cambridge, and did her studies for her PhD in Environmental Studies at Yale University. Now, a lot of times when we do these introductions, we could just keep reading CVs and reading about classes and publications, but I'm actually going to read some of Dr. Hsu's own words because they relate very much to this topic and also relate very much to what Carolina Public Humanities does with community colleges. Just last week, I was in Manteo at the College of the Albemarle, Dare County, as part of this Snapshot Climate exhibition. This is a series of photographs put together by Southern Cultures magazine documenting climate change throughout the South. And we've been bringing this to different community colleges and having their students and community members add to the collection. And then we bring a speaker out to talk about climate change. It's a really wonderful initiative. And so certainly we would love to talk to Wayne Community College about hosting that here if they're so interested. But what is a wonderful just tying in here is that the copy of Southern Cultures that has this whole collection, again, of incredible photographs, has an introduction written by none other than Dr. Angel Hsu. So I'm going to read just this little piece. This is, these are your own words, so you can't take them back, okay? She writes, this is in the introduction, Making the Invisible Visible for a Climate Future. I have formed my career researching the environment, built in natural, physical, and biological, at the interface of climate science and policy. After my first year of college, I spent a formative summer studying insect-plant interactions in the lowland forests of Costa Rica. I will never forget the awe-inspiring biodiversity and the deep guttural rumblings of howler monkeys waking me up at dawn. When I returned to campus the following fall, I realized that whatever scientific discovery I had made that summer would not matter much if the rainforest no longer existed. And so I paired my studies of biological sciences with an academic pursuit in political sciences, giving me a better understanding of the role of institutions and public policy in addressing environmental issues, including the overarching problem of our age, climate change. Although I no longer tramp through the rainforest in search of samples for scientific experimentation, I remind myself and my students daily of the importance of scientific inquiry in the pursuit of policy solutions. There's still so much to learn about the physical world, many questions to pose about human civilization's development paths, and actions to propose that would reduce our contributions to climate change and mitigates its worst effects. These are very wise words from our upcoming speaker, and the first part of that is communicating, and we have a public humanist par excellence able to communicate all of the important pieces of this incredibly critical moment in our time. So please welcome Dr. Angel Hsu.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Max, for that really kind introduction, although next time I heard that he's going to actually play the piano and give a musical rendition of the intro, so I really look forward to that. But thank you so much to Wayne Community College for having me here. This is my first time in Goldsboro, but I hope it's one trip of many. So I just wanted to add a little bit to Max's excellent introduction and give you a little bit more background for why I'm here and talking to you about China and America's relationship with China on such an important issue of climate change. So my job before, actually the first job I had out of grad school was working at a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the World Resources Institute. And I worked on a project called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Initiative. And it may not sound that sexy, but to me it was fascinating because I was developing tools and protocols for businesses and governments to measure their carbon footprints, their greenhouse gas emissions. And then they sent me to China as one of the first jobs that I had to go and talk to Chinese businesses and governments to try to convince them to do something on climate change. And there, my eyes were really open to the possibility and the need for more data and quantitative approaches to help them underpin sound environmental policy. And this was something that the business world had long recognized, that you need data, key performance indicators. I need to know whether or not this product is making a profit or how much energy I'm using. But that same kind of logic had not yet translated into the policy community. And so that really inspired my PhD. And so then I did my PhD in an interdisciplinary program where I got to bridge statistics and data science and geography, satellite remote sensing, and then also policy together to tackle this really super wicked and challenging problem of climate change. And so that's the inspiration for my research group, the Data-Driven EnviroLab. And I was most recently teaching at Yale and US College in Singapore for 5 years before moving closer to home. So I'm actually from South Carolina. I grew up in the Greer, Greenville, Spartanburg area. And then, as Max mentioned, I went to college in North Carolina. So when the opportunity came to come closer to home, I moved here. So the talk today, I want to structure around 5 myths. And so I'm working on a book project right now where I can't tell you how many times I told people when I was working on my dissertation, I'm studying China's environmental policy. And they would come back and say, what environmental policy? Or I hear they're doing terrible things to their environment and they're destroying the planet. And while some of those claims are not unnecessarily false, I really feel like there's a lot more nuance, and China has really done a lot on the environment and climate change. And so there are 5 myths that I want to debunk in this presentation. So the first one, climate change is a far-off problem. We don't need to worry about it. The second myth, acting on climate change is not in China's self-interest, so that's why they're not doing anything or enough on climate. And that goes to myths 3 and 4. China isn't doing anything on climate. This is a myth I've heard a lot. And then also, many people have said, well, even if China's doing something on climate change, they're not doing enough. And then lastly is this myth that we have to cooperate with China on climate change, and that's the only mode of engagement. So I want to try to debunk that and then pose for you some alternative ways that we might compete with China on clean energy and climate change issues in a way that can also benefit other countries. So before we go to the myths, I want to first just give a brief introduction of China and orient ourselves to the country. So this is a map of China, and just some key facts. It's the world's most populous country, although India is soon to overtake it, so about 1.4 billion people living in China. It's the world's 2nd largest economy, just behind the United States. It is the world's largest manufacturer. So you may have heard of China being the workshop of the world, and so many products and so many of our electronics come from China, and it has the world's largest standing army. It also is home to the most number of KFCs in the world. So that might come as a surprise to you, but it's hugely popular there. When I was doing my dissertation research, I was traveling all throughout China. I went to 13 different provinces, and I always had breakfast in a KFC because I knew every city was going to have one, and it would be delicious. Also, China has undergone a huge transformation in the last several decades since it started to open up its economy in 1978. So then Premier Deng Xiaoping instituted a series of market reforms and wanted to actually open up China's economy and introduce capitalism. And you can see this is the Pearl River Delta region in southern China. And just in this short period of time, it went from a fishing village of 300,000 people and about 30,000 workers to now a city with over 17 million people. And it was one of China's special economic zones that first opened up China and demonstrated to government leaders that they could actually make this capitalism work. And as a result, you can just see this is satellite data measuring nighttime lights, and then they've taken that data and made it into a measure of GDP. And so you can just see how much from 1955, and this is actually projecting into the future, China's cities have grown so much. They've really been a driver of China's economic growth. So now 66% of China's population is living in these cities, primarily along the east, and that number is expected to get to about 3/4 by 2030. So huge amounts of GDP growth, really double-digit GDP growth rates early when they started to open their economy, and only recently have they started to slow to only around 5 to 6% of GDP growth rate per year. And so you can see the result of that. In the early 2000s, China surpassed Germany and then Japan, and it now is the 2nd largest economy behind the United States. And then they're forecasted to become the largest economy by 2030. And so the US is behind, and then India is projected to be the 3rd largest economy behind the US by 2030. So huge amounts of economic growth, which has led to all sorts of questions about what does China's economic rise also mean geopolitically as well. And then, of course, following this huge growth in cities and also its economy have been these books that people have published regarding China's environment. So this is by Elizabeth Economy. She wrote this book, The River Runs Black. I remember reading this in college, and it's all about China's environmental destruction as it's been industrializing and cities have grown. So has water pollution and air pollution. So absolutely choking on growth, as this New York Times series emphasizes. And then Jonathan Watts, he was a Guardian reporter that lived in China for a number of years. When a billion Chinese jump, how China will save mankind or destroy it, these very bombastic headlines. And then Judith Shapiro, she's at American University, wrote this book actually predating China's opening and reform, talking about Mao. So this was communist leader Mao Zedong, the war that he waged against nature in trying to build the Chinese communist state. So overwhelmingly, when I started studying China, these were the headlines, and this is the literature that I was faced with. And so this is how I'm going to start this presentation, is trying to debunk some of the myths and how do we understand what China is actually doing on these environmental issues and how we might be able to work with it. So first of all, climate change is a far-off problem. So I teach a class on climate change at UNC, so I'm going to give you a primer of the climate change data and science. So everything I teach in a semester, I'm going to try to do in 5 minutes, so bear with me. So you probably are familiar with this image. This is basically the greenhouse gas effect. This is what's going on when we talk about climate change and global warming. Energy comes in from the sun. Some of it is directly absorbed by the surface of the Earth, but then also due to greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane in the Earth's atmosphere, which is this very thin shell here in blue, absorbs some of that radiant energy, and some of it gets re-radiated back to Earth in a form of long-wave radiation, and some of it then is also reflected back into space. So that's basically the greenhouse gas effect that keeps our planet a stable temperature and allows us and plants and animals to be able to survive. But what's been happening due to the Industrial Revolution, and since really the 1860s, 1870s, when we started to industrialize and started to extract fossil fuels from the ground, coal, oil, natural gas, and combusting that, is we can see that carbon dioxide emissions, so these concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, has increased. So this is from 1983, this is actually when I was born. Scientists measured atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide to be around 343 parts per million. So that's like less than 0.3% of the atmosphere. So it's really just a very tiny fraction, but they have such an outsized impact on keeping the Earth warm. Now, if we look at today, those greenhouse gas concentrations of carbon dioxide have increased to about 418 parts per million, just in my lifetime alone. At the same time, temperatures are also warmer than what they used to be. So back in 1983, when I was born, average temperatures compared to a century baseline, so between 1901 to about 2000, were only on average about 0.27 degrees Celsius. So that's like a 1 degree Fahrenheit above this baseline. But then since I've been alive, those temperatures now look to be about 1.57 degrees Celsius. So that's more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit on average warmer than they were just a century ago. So we can actually observe with data that temperatures are getting warmer. You can see this overall increasing linear trend. And then during the same time, if we look at monthly temperatures, so actually last year, I was shocked. It was 85 degrees on my birthday. My birthday's in February. And that's one of the warmest Februaries I think I had ever experienced. And that's exactly what's been happening over the last 20 years when we have experienced the 20 hottest years on record. And so all of these lines here, you can see 2000, 2006, 2015, 2002, 2020, 2016 was previously the warmest year on record. Januaries, Marches, Aprils, these were all much warmer than they were. Probably you can remember some of these, my parents and grandparents' generations, 1971, 1965, tended to be cooler than they are today. And last summer was the hottest summer on record. The June-July period in 2023 was the hottest on record ever. And already we're seeing huge impacts that these temperature increases have had on our society. So we can take a look, and I don't know what's going on with this clicker. It's going a little bit funny on me. But we can see these are 30-year periods. This is what meteorologists use to talk about normal temperatures, or what typical temperatures should look like. And so just in 1901 to 1930, at the beginning of the 20th century, you can see that in general, areas around tended to be cooler, about 1 degree Celsius or Fahrenheit cooler than they were even, I guess this would be compared again to a 1900 average. And so every single 30-year period, we can see that temperatures have slowly gotten warmer all across the United States until we get to this map here, 1991 to 2020, where virtually every part of the United States is warmer, in some cases much warmer, more than a 1.1 or even 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they were just a few decades ago. So we're seeing this across the United States. And These headlines are very common now, whereas a decade or even 2 decades ago, it wasn't so easy. But you can just Google climate change, and then I did this in about a minute, and I was able to click all of these different headlines where record-breaking summer temperatures in Phoenix, Memphis, Houston continue to shatter records. China, too, 2 summers ago, experienced its worst heat wave on record ever. They went 70 days with temperatures over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It was incredibly disruptive to agriculture systems, led to huge droughts as well, and disruption in hydroelectricity where they get a lot of their power. And in the United States, people are dying. Last summer, Seattle had 6 deaths. And so this is a common issue, also increasing in terms of wildfires as well, making those much more common and much more regular and much more prolonged than they were just a few years ago. And that is having huge impacts on our daily lives. So even if we're not in an area that's experiencing a heat wave, we are experiencing huge shortages in agricultural products like mustard and coffee, chili peppers, and wine. There was a huge chip shortage due to these heat waves in China. So if you try to buy a minivan, for example, I have friends in Raleigh who were on a waiting list for 2 years to try to buy a minivan, but because of these chip shortages, they could not get one. If anyone is a Taylor Swift fan in the room, also, my sister lives in Brazil, and she was going to take her daughter to go see Taylor Swift, and they had to cancel her concert because they experienced a heat wave, an unprecedented heat wave in Brazil, and a fan actually died from going to one of her concerts. So this is just evidence that climate change is here, it's happening, it's not a phenomenon that's so far away that we don't need to worry about it, or only our grandchildren or their grandchildren need to worry about. In the data, and I only showed you just a fraction of the data, but in my class I show multiple lines of data from loss of land ice to sea level rise to glacier loss to increasing extreme events like hurricanes. It's all evidence that climate change is here. And so this is a quote from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a scientific body where governments all around the world nominate scientists. I'm actually one of the authors that was included in this report. And it's actually, this is a very bold statement. Scientists, we don't like to be very bold in our statements and say things like indisputable or words like incontrovertible or undeniable, but there was so much scientific evidence facing us when we were working on this report that this was one of the headline conclusions that we felt comfortable making, which is it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts more frequent and severe. So if anyone, and I tell my students this, if anyone says, oh, I'm not sure, I don't think that the scientists are sure, there's still a lot of debate and uncertainty, I'm here to tell you that based on the latest science, we have no questions when it comes to the fact that climate change is happening, temperatures are getting warmer, and we're already feeling the effects. Okay, so now on to the second myth, which is acting on climate change isn't in China's self-interest. And this is an important myth to debunk because China is the #1 emitter when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gases. So this is the #1 fact. And, but for many years, China was not stepping into a global role of leadership on the issue because it still only has an average GDP per person of around $10,000, $12,000 US per person. And so that's far below the average income level of the average US citizen. And so China has not necessarily been very forthcoming about wanting to take leadership on the climate change issue. And so in my early days of working on my dissertation, I really wanted to understand why China would have any type of motivation to tackle the issue. So I'm going to tell you what I found. First of all, air pollution is an incredibly important issue in China. This is a satellite remote sensing image of northeastern China. So Beijing is here, this is the Bohai Sea, and you can see in the satellite image these gray swaths. This is all air pollution. Air pollution predominantly from China's energy system, and I'll talk about that in a second, but burning coal and fossil fuels, which make up a huge percentage of its electricity usage. And the air pollution, when I was living in Beijing, so I lived there from between 2006 and 2013, continuously I was there for a Fulbright fellowship working at a Chinese university on issues like air pollution and monitoring and data, and there were many days that look like this. I mean, this is incredibly, these are people doing Tai Chi, and this is from a New York Times headline. It said, on a scale of 0 to 500, so this is the scale that normally we measure air pollution and its health impact. So 500 is the worst, 0 is the best. Beijing's air quality topped crazy bad at 755. So it was off the charts. I mean, there were so many days I lived there where I did not see the sun, and it was due to air pollution. And it was so interesting. Yeah, here's other images. This is a picture from Shenyang in southeastern China, where you see the air quality index exceeded 1,400 on a scale of 500. In the US, the scale ends at 350. And here, it's well above. And then this is in Beijing, in downtown Beijing. The CCTV tower is also known more colloquially as the pants building, because it looks like a pair of pants. So this person on social media just drew the pants because you can't even see them from where they are in downtown Beijing. So this is just everyday life. I mean, you literally could not even breathe. And it was so interesting because my early days in working in China, my Chinese colleagues would say, oh, you know, the fog is very bad. The word in Chinese for fog is umai. And I was thinking, it's not umai, it's uran, it's pollution. But at that time, they were not willing to recognize the extent of their problems. But really, it really reached a head when millions of people are dying every single year from exposure to air pollution. So if we take a look at this figure here, you can kind of see the reason why air pollution is so bad in China. You can see industry here, 43% in terms of sources of air pollution. And it says residential, but it's really some from burning coal and other types of fuel indoors, but really also from its electricity sector. And that's quite different from India, where they have a lot of air pollution from residential areas. And all throughout South Asia, air pollution is an incredibly important issue. But for China, it's industry and industrialization. They also have a lot of dust. The Gobi Desert is right there. We mentioned fossil fuel combustion, mobile sources from cars and trucks. Also, transboundary air pollution is an issue. And agricultural biomass, so farmers, if they don't have any alternative to get rid of agricultural residue, then they have to burn that, and that also generates a ton of air pollution. But then predominantly what I mentioned is coal. So we can see China's primary energy consumption, where they're actually getting their energy, and about 2/3 of it is from coal, and then oil. So these two sources, particularly coal, which is very high in sulfur content, generates a huge amount of air pollution in terms of sulfur dioxide. And that has led to an average of 2 million premature deaths. This is a map of premature deaths due to air pollution. And you can see China is bright red and India is here also in bright red. And so that's here, this is the scale is 1.5 million premature deaths a year just from outdoor air pollution. So this is a major reason why they're interested in tackling climate change, because the same sources that are generating air pollution, coal, oil, and other fossil fuels, also generate greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. All of these come from the same sources. And so really, China is interested in tackling climate change first and foremost to protect their people from the harms of air pollution. And so I just wanted to show a picture. I was just in Beijing in January of this year. Look, this is Tsinghua University's campus. Look at how blue the skies are. It was incredible. And then from the same time period, this is when I was a student here in 2011, the same campus, you can see the same building here. It's on the other side of the main walk, but just night and day in terms of air pollution. So they've done a ton to try to clean up the air pollution. And so that's really been the cornerstone of their climate policy. Secondly, they're acting on climate change because of energy security. So in the early days of China's industrialization and developing all these factories and all of these manufacturing facilities, they were really worried about energy security and having lights and power to make sure that all of these factories could keep going. And so from an energy security perspective, that's also why they've been seeking alternative energy sources like hydropower and nuclear and also solar and wind as alternatives to fossil fuels because of potential energy shortages. If we take a look at this figure, you can see that China's energy demand has basically quadrupled since 1990. And every time these international energy agencies make their predictions about the growth in China's energy demand, they are always wrong because China keeps outpacing the demand from the growth of their economy. So this is also a huge concern. And then another point is the fact that China is feeling the impacts of climate change. It wasn't just that heat wave. They have been regularly experiencing changes in monsoon patterns, floods and droughts, and other types of climate impacts. So this is a visualization of Shanghai on the east coast of China and what happens to Shanghai under a 4 degrees warming scenario. So I told you and showed you in that data that right now we're looking at about 1.57 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This is what happens if we reach 4. So basically Shanghai disappears from the map. And so this is a pretty dramatic visualization. Some people have said, oh, but maybe they can be like Amsterdam and then just start building their streets higher and higher. And it's like, yes, they probably could. That would be hugely expensive. But in China, they understand the impacts of climate change. So if we take a look, this is a map of that heat wave from the summer of 2022. And you can see all across the country, there were temperatures So it said previous July temperature record broken, and you can see all the areas in red. This is where it was more than 2 degrees higher than that previous temperature record. And so progressively, they are getting much and much hotter. And then this is a lake, essentially in China. I can't remember which lake it is, but this is a lake in China that is essentially dried up as a result of these heat waves. So they are experiencing the impacts of climate change. They know it's serious, it's disruptive to not only their economy, but also to daily life, and people are dying under this amount of heat stress, and so that's another reason for them acting. The last point is they are also concerned about political stability. So China politically is an autocracy, it's an authoritarian regime, and so the Chinese Communist Party has every incentive to remain in power. And these protests that happened several years ago, protesting the construction of these petrochemical plants, these PX petrochemical plants, you can see a map of some of these protests that happened throughout China, mainly along the eastern coast, but then also some in central and interior China. These were very concerning for the Chinese government. They didn't want people to protest and potentially lead to political instability. And so this is one way that a lot of other scholars have argued China has been able to maintain its performance legitimacy. So by addressing environmental concerns, cleaning up the air, these are easy wins for Chinese citizens to feel that they're being protected and that the government is being responsive. So for these 4 reasons, 1, air pollution, secondly, energy security, 3, China is facing climate change impacts, and 4, political stability. These are main reasons why I argue that China is interested in acting on climate change. But then you may say, well, what exactly are they doing on climate change? And do they have any policies on place that are actually effective and being implemented? Well, we can take a look at how China is actually addressing the problem. And one is through policy. This is a screenshot of their first climate change policy, which, if you can see the date, June 2007. Does anyone have any idea when the United States implemented its first climate change policy? We still don't have any. So if you're silent, you're absolutely right, because we still do not have a national climate change strategy. China has had one since 2007. And they do this through these 5-year development plans, very similar to the Soviet system of these 5-year development plans. But unlike the United States, we have the annual State of Union address, and that kind of lays out some overall guidelines. For China, these are actually binding law. So when they develop these 5-year plans, they have these overarching targets, and then they pass those down to the provinces, to the municipalities, to the townships, and to those special economic development zones like Shenzhen. And then also they have particular agencies, so the energy sector, the environment ministry, they all have to develop their own versions of these 5-year plans to say, how are they going to meet these targets to reduce sulfur dioxide pollution? Or how are we going to meet these targets to reduce energy and carbon intensity? So that's very critical, and these are binding pieces of legislation. So every province, every municipality, every sector, they have to achieve these targets. And so if we take a look at the latest target, so this is from 2021 to 2025, these are the targets that China has put in place to address climate and energy. So 1, they want to reduce carbon intensity by 18% from 2020 levels. They want to reduce energy intensity as well. They also want to increase forest coverage, and this is a big one too, is increasing the share of non-fossil sources in the energy mix to around 20%. So actually they've already exceeded this target, and now they've upped it to 25% because they've already reached this well ahead of target. And then as part of this, a few years ago in 2020, they actually announced a plan to completely decarbonize their economy. This is really critical because that panel of scientists that I mentioned earlier, the IPCC, in the science, it says that the world has to actually decarbonize by 2050 if we want to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. So the world has to decarbonize. We have to completely rid ourselves of relying on fossil fuels. And so many other countries, including the United States, have actually set their own targets to decarbonize or to achieve net zero emissions. So it was really momentous. It was so exciting when China actually announced their target, because they were one of the first developing countries, and certainly in terms of major economies, if you compare Brazil and India, South Africa, they were one of the first major economies to announce that they're going to also decarbonize their economy. And that's not going to be easy because, as I mentioned, 65% of their energy mix is still coal, and also about the same 2/3 of their electricity is also generated from coal. So that's going to require a huge, huge transition. They're going to have to eliminate all coal from electricity production by 2050. And they're going to have to reduce GHG emissions by about 90% by 2050. And then they're going to have to peak their carbon dioxide emissions. So the peaking, that's basically what this is showing. They're going to have to peak by 2030 their carbon dioxide emissions, which they still have not been able to do. They're still growing. And then they're going to have to steep, it's like falling off a cliff. They're going to have to reduce those emissions. And so they're doing that largely through recognizing that if there are economic opportunities associated with addressing climate change. And so this has been a model now, and we can talk more in the Q&A for why I think that this is a new model for many other countries, but they had long recognized that there was a huge opportunity in addressing climate change through clean energy. So this was very, I think, ahead of their time, and US is now only starting to get wise on this, and so that's why Biden has been trying so much to try to galvanize and catalyze clean energy in the United States, because you take a look at these metrics. China, in terms of renewable power capacity, #1. Renewable power capacity, not including hydro, #1. Biopower capacity, #1. Hydropower capacity, #1. Solar photovoltaic, wind power capacity, #1. Solar water heating capacity, #1. China is literally winning at all of these metrics, being the #1 country in so many of these technologies. They produce 2/3 of the world's solar panels, 99% of the world's electric buses, 3/4 of the world's electric wind turbines. And so it's just remarkable. So they recognized very early on that there was a huge economic opportunity if they invested in these clean energy technologies that could also help them address the climate change problem. And the world has benefited as a result. And so this is just a fun animation of wind power, and you can see all the green dots of wind power growing all throughout China. This is wind turbines that are installed. But then also if we take a look at the data, China's investment in manufacturing all these technologies has directly led to the decrease in the cost of these technologies. That's what this is, the globalized, levelized cost of energy. So for concentrated solar power, it led to 47% reduction. Solar photovoltaic, 82% reduction in the cost of these technologies. So globally, China has also saved US and Germany around $68 billion in terms of development and manufacturing costs. And they made these technologies so much cheaper. So for countries all around the world, it is now cheaper for them to power their power plants using one of these clean energy technologies than it would be to use conventional fossil fuels. Really, the only reason why fossil fuels are cheaper in many of these other countries is because governments subsidize the cost to make it artificially cheaper than these technologies. So this is one of the huge conclusions in our IPCC report. And for me, it gives us a lot of optimism because we have alternatives that are cheap, they're available, they're plentiful, and it's largely due to China's leadership. And so you may say, but I still don't think China's doing enough on climate. And so I will say that yes, you would be right to be a little bit skeptical. So I'm not going to try to debunk you completely from that myth, because I also agree, I think that China could do enough. And that's because if we take a look at this data, China still has a ton of coal-fired power plants. 50% of the world's total coal-fired capacity is actually in China. And people always say, well, Angel, they're building coal-fired power plants every single day. And I say, well, it's not every day, now it's about a week. But still, why are they building coal-fired power plants if they have promised all of these great things on climate change and they promised to get rid of coal-fired power? Yes, this is a huge problem. This is the subject of a whole chapter of this book project, which I don't have time to get into now, but I will say this is a really big challenge. And there are many reasons why China is continuing to build coal-fired power plants. But part of it has to do with energy demand. Another part has to do with they still are dealing with some intermittency issues of renewable energy, which is the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and a lot of China's renewable energy resources are not actually where people are. So they have to build a lot more infrastructure to actually connect that renewable energy to where people need to consume it. That's one of the problems. Another problem is this saying in Chinese. So there's a saying in Chinese that 山高皇帝远, which is the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. So in China, it's huge. It's comparable to the United States. It's absolutely massive. And so even though the central government is making these 5-year development plans, they have these binding targets for carbon intensity and energy intensity that we just saw, it still doesn't mean that people living in southwest China, let's say in Yunnan province or in Guiyang, they necessarily have the same priorities as in China. And China is incredibly diverse in terms of its economic development, and so for those provinces, economic development is still #1, and that often comes into conflict with these environmental goals that the central government has put in place. And so if we take a look at this central governance structure, we can see some of the challenges. So you have the central government, and then they have centrally administered municipalities. This is like Beijing, Chongqing, Shanghai, and then you have these provinces, and it goes all the way down to the township and villages. And so you have in this, what in the literature has referred to as the Tiao and the Kwai system, you often have competing priorities where the bottom unit, the village, doesn't necessarily share the same priorities as the central level, and then a lot gets lost in translation. So that's still a huge challenge in China, is how to actually have policies implemented at the very local level in a way that the central government has articulated and defined. And then here also, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, so you can read this. This was from a few years ago, right before the climate negotiations in Scotland of 2021. And they asked me, they said, well, yeah, why is it that China, and they're still building all these coal-fired power plants, and they were actually, in this summer, they were mining more coal. They had closed 5,000 coal mines, and they were opening them up, and they were mining more coal. And it was largely due to energy shortage problems that were happening all across China. You can see in blue, there were huge energy shortage crises. They hadn't mined enough coal, and there were shortages in the winter, and then also that trickled and affected summer as well. And so there were a lot of people at that time questioning China's dedication to the climate change issue. And so one of the points that I made in this article was that it's like a ship, like a gigantic ship, and it takes time to gather that momentum and for the ship to turn. So even though China is starting, they still don't yet have that momentum to completely turn. So I think in terms of this particular myth, you would be right to be skeptical that China is certainly not doing enough. Because I've also argued that, but then I also kind of defended them as well, and saying, well, you know, let's look at where US was in the similar development stage. China is doing a lot, but they certainly could be doing more. So then going to the last myth, the US must cooperate with China on climate. So I'm going to start with showing you some data for why it's only natural for us to think that we need to cooperate with China as the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. China and the US are considered superpowers on many different levels. So you can see in many ways where these petals of blue and red overlap, they're very similar in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of exports, literacy rate, Olympic gold medals, very similar. But in many ways, they're also very different. We talked about GDP per capita. So this is a little bit out of date, but you can see, well, this was just a few years old, $49,800 per person in the US, only $9,100 per person for China. So you can see, yeah, here they have digital connectivity, but that's also, I think, caught up. But in many ways, US and China are very similar and thought of as the G2, or two critical global superpowers. In terms of climate change, they're quite similar, but also quite different. So the US, you can see the #2 largest emitter of climate change, and then here is China. You can see that the two together actually total about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's huge. That's more than Europe combined, or other countries like Russia, Canada. And so it just makes sense that if you get the two countries together, you're really tackling almost half of global emissions. But there are real differences as we go back to this, the development levels. This difference here is one of the main reasons why it's been so tricky to get the two countries to agree in an international stage. So the current framework that we have to address climate change emissions is the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I know I only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to try to speed up. But this is the global framework. Right now there's about 196 countries that have all pledged to do something on climate change globally. You can see in yellow, these are developing countries. They comprise the majority of countries to the convention. And in green and blue, these are developed countries. So when countries got together in 1992 and articulated the UNFCCC, at that time, the majority of the world's emissions were coming from the green and the blue countries, from developed countries. But now we take a look and we see that the blue and the green countries' emissions have already peaked, and they've been falling, and they're going to continue to decrease. Those other countries in yellow are growing very rapidly. And this is one of the reasons why the United States did not agree to the Kyoto Protocol, and also did not agree to accepting emissions limits for itself when countries like China, India, and Brazil could be allowed to continue growing their emissions. And so fast forward to 2014, and President Obama and President Xi Jinping finally got together and they broke this impasse, because for many years China said, we're not acting unless US acts. US said, we're not acting until China acts. So it was definitely this back and forth until leading up to the Paris Agreement, the two countries met, and it was incredible. So the Paris Agreement, which was agreed upon and negotiated in 2015, basically turned the whole process on its head and said, we are going to allow countries like China and US to decide what they're going to pledge. So every country can use their own approach. So everyone has to do something, but that approach can really vary. And US and China were considered absolutely critical to achieving that agreement and securing the Paris Accord. And they did that by agreeing to different things. So the United States, you can see in blue, agreed to reduce emissions 17% by 2005 levels by 2020. So you can see that dotted line overall reducing the size of its emissions. China allowed its emissions to grow, but they're reducing the intensity 40 to 45%. So still allowing the overall emission space to grow, but then just slowing the rate at which that happens. So that's still allowed, and that's how they could agree. So still allowing for some growth from China, and then also reducing from the United States. But then if we take a look at data from the Climate Action Tracker, we see that neither of these pledges, in terms of science and what's needed to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change, neither of them have been deemed particularly sufficient for doing that, so not ambitious enough. And so this is why in my work I'm particularly interested in alternative approaches. So if we can't rely on national governments to help us deliver the action that we need to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change, then where can we actually find alternatives? And so a lot of my work is looking at the role of businesses and subnational entities like cities and states and provinces to continue progress on climate change, because we saw that when President Trump came to power in 2016, he immediately rolled back any type of climate adjacent legislation that we had, like the Clean Power Plan that Obama had put in. And so really during that time, this is former California Governor Jerry Brown. He actually met with President Xi Jinping during that time to talk about cooperation between US and China on climate change. That's highly unusual for a governor to actually meet with a head of state. But this was really the only progress that happened from 2016 to 2020 between the US and China on climate change. So I would go to these international conferences, and as an American, people would say, how could you even show your face here? And I said, well, there's so much subnational work that's going on. California and China, they signed 20 joint declarations to work together on emissions trading and clean vehicles and other types of capacity building. And that was really important to keep credibility of the United States even during this very intense time. So my research, we have documented all the different instances. So these are cities and states in the United States that have pledged climate action. So that comprises about 72% of the US population. In China too, you can see 27 cities and regions, about half of the population, they have all made their own pledges on climate change. So regardless of what the national governments are doing or who's in power, this might be a more robust way for parties to collaborate on the climate change issue. And it's not just one way. It's not just, we should be telling China what they should do on climate change. We can actually learn a lot from China. So recently, California Governor Gavin Newsom, he's here, signed a MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with Jiangsu Province on wind power. So Jiangsu is doing a ton on offshore wind that the United States could also learn from. 15 cities in China have electrified all public vehicles. Also, in Shenzhen, they now have 16,000 electric buses and 22,000 electric taxis. That is tremendous if you think about that. And then there's another island in China, Hainan Island, that has already banned the sale of fossil fuel powered vehicles by 2030. So they're doing a lot that we could potentially learn from. And so I'm going to leave you with this question of, okay, well, should we cooperate where it's very uncertain? There could be geopolitical shifts in our top leadership, or in instances like when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and then China cut off all communication with the United States on climate change. So should we be trying to cooperate where we are uncertain about these geopolitical events that could happen that could really shake and alter the relationship, or are there other alternatives? Could we compete, for example, on clean energy? And could that be a way, if China and the United States are both racing to provide clean energy technologies to other countries, could that also be a way to also drive down global carbon emissions? And I think there's a lot of potential for that. So in 2021, President Xi Jinping, he said that China is no longer going to fund any coal-fired power plants abroad in developing countries. And that's a huge deal. I lived in Southeast Asia for 5 years, and that's where a lot of the excess coal-fired capacity from China was going. And so a lot of Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, they were all buying these coal-fired power plants from China. And you can see in these numbers that China, a huge, huge investor in coal overseas in Asia, and oil in Europe and Central Asia, and also oil in Latin America. So what happens when China says we're no longer going to actually make these investments in these polluting sectors? That could be a huge opportunity for US or other providers to step up with these clean energy technologies. So you can see that China's overseas investment, 22% was actually in coal, and you can see some of the top beneficiaries that I mentioned: Indonesia, India, Vietnam, all of these countries. But many of them now are pledging their own decarbonization goals. So now 10 countries in Southeast Asia have also said that they want to decarbonize. And so they're going to be looking for alternatives like wind power and electric vehicles and solar power to try to replace some of the fossil-fired technology that they can no longer use, because the science is very clear. If we're going to achieve our climate goals and avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change, we have to keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and we have to do that by getting to net zero emissions. And then looking at the investment numbers, there's a lot more potential in investing in renewable energy than in coal. So that's an area where, in particular, US is trying to compete. So if you took a look at the infrastructure plan and some of these, the IRA and all these other bills that also are trying to galvanize and encourage clean energy investment in the United States and giving people, consumers. Now if you want to have a heat pump in your house, you can get a tax credit for that. Or if you want to buy an electric vehicle, you can also get a tax credit for that. So there's a huge opportunity for the US to try to compete in these arenas. So this is kind of a complicated last slide to end on, but what I'm thinking is also, if we think about areas of cooperation and areas where we should be competing, we can kind of think about it in this way. So are there some technologies where we could cooperate and there would be increasing global gains? So in terms of carbon capture, that's a hugely expensive technology where it doesn't make sense for one country to invest in that technology by itself. And so it's like that model of the solar PV being reduced by 82%. Perhaps if China and the US were to come together and work on these technologies together, we could benefit the world by driving down costs. But then there could be other areas like clean energy manufacturing, like solar and wind, where it actually might make sense for us to compete, because then we could inspire a green race to the top, where we could see who can provide these technologies more cheaply to other countries, like developing countries in Southeast Asia or in Latin America, for example. So so this is what I'm thinking about in terms of how we don't necessarily need to always cooperate. There could be areas where we could compete with China and also achieve global goals on climate change and energy. So I'll just leave you with some resources for some further reading. This is a great handbook to just get some background on energy and climate issues in China. I wrote a chapter here on air pollution, so if you're interested in diving more on the air pollution issue in China, that's a great one. This is by Barbara Finnemore. She worked for NRDC for many years. This is a great book from her perspective. And then China Dialogue, they have just a great bilingual resource. So they translate written pieces in both Mandarin and also in English. And so you can read what also Chinese counterparts are thinking about these issues. It's a wonderful resource to learn more about China's environment and climate change. And so thank you so much. I think we do have a few minutes left for questions, so really appreciate hearing from you. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hsu. That was fabulous. If you'll raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you. We'd like for you to use the mic so that we can capture it for our live stream audience. And
I know that was very fast. I tried to cram like 15 years of research, 40 minutes.
Oh, great.
What part, if any, does nuclear power play in the picture for
Yes.
China or for other countries?
Yeah, no, I mean, so absolutely, nuclear is emissions free, so both in terms of air pollution and also in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's absolutely a huge part of the picture, and for China, absolutely. So they have targets also for nuclear energy, and it's part of their decarbonization strategy as well. So it's absolutely a part of the picture, but they have not actually been making the targets that they set for themselves, unlike solar and wind and reducing in terms of coal consumption. That's one where they haven't been able to meet their targets as much, so because it's quite expensive, and then safety is obviously an issue. Like when I lived in China in 2010 was the Fukushima Daiichi accident in Japan, and it was unbelievable living in Beijing and hearing people very concerned about radiation and radiation poisoning. And I was sitting there in Beijing and saying, hello, air pollution is probably going to kill you before this radiation from this disaster. But it's absolutely part of the picture. And if you look at all of the global scenarios, there is an assumption that nuclear is going to continue to be part of the energy mix for decades to come.
In your travels or visits to China, did you see fields of the solar, what we're seeing in North Carolina? In fact, I was really
Yes.
proud on your map that North Carolina seems to be making progress, whereas my birth state, Virginia, was not, had no red dots on it. But did you see wind turbine fields and solar fields
Yes.
throughout China?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is really remarkable because, yeah, you see these solar farms, and then there's rooftop solar is another big part. Even on the roofs, just even in rural China, solar water heaters, they're on the rooftop of every single building, which is incredible. I mean, China, they were very early on in manufacturing that particular technology, and then they also export that. But that always like struck me as, why don't we have that in the United States? Like, I feel like in North Carolina, we have a lot of really sunny days, and would be a great way. I mean, right now I'm having to spend, I think, like $5,000 on a new water heater, and it's like, it would be great to have a solar water heater. And yeah, to heat the water instead. And you go anywhere in China and they have solar water heaters. But yeah, they're also developing like smaller wind turbines that they can actually site within urban areas, which would be really incredible because yeah, that's one complaint in the United States of wind turbines. Some people don't like the way they look, or they think that they're gonna kill the birds, or all these, they might be loud. There's lots of different perceptions of these different technologies. But yeah, it's continuously improving, and in China, it's incredible. If you watch my TED Talk on China, I show an image of some of the solar arrays that they've shaped into pandas. It's very cute. So you can also see panda-shaped solar farms in China. But yeah, it is remarkable. I would encourage anyone, if you haven't been to China, now that they've opened back up, to just go there because it's so fascinating. And even if you haven't been in a while, just going, it's just completely changed. But definitely email me because I will give you a lot of tips. It's now very challenging. You have to use, everything's mobile. You can't like pay for anything in cash. So anyways, I can give you advice on going to China, but it is remarkable. It is just incredible to see the pace and the scale of transformation on clean energy. And you can see it, yeah, right before your eyes.
I have a question about
Yeah.
if you have any data or any information or even just a perspective on so many people who've been resistant to even acknowledging climate change here in the United States. Do you see a trend of people being more receptive to responding to this?
Yeah, so I was at Yale for quite a number of years, and they have a great project called the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, and they partner with George Mason University to do annual surveys. And so they survey people all throughout the United States at the census tract level, and they've done this now for more than 10 years, just this opinion surveys on climate change. And it's really striking. So 78% of Americans actually believe that climate change is real and that humans are the cause of it. And I think also an equally high percentage, like 75% of people in that survey also think that the government should also be taking strong action on climate change. But then they have like a whole series of questions, several dozen questions that go into a lot of granular detail. But yeah, there's really good data from the Yale program on climate change communication exactly on that. I think the most striking, and they've also actually replicated it for China. So they have a China version and also an India version. So you can also compare to see how attitudes compare between China, US, and India. And definitely there's much higher belief in climate change in China, absolutely, than in the United States. I think it's a lot more of a politicized issue. But there still is a remarkably high number, even in red states, there still is a remarkably high number of Americans who believe that climate change is a problem and that is happening. But I will say one statistic that really struck me in recently looking at that data is the number of people who regularly talk about climate change. So even if they believe in it, only about 35% actually reported talking about climate change. So for me as an educator, that really stood out to me because I was like, oh my God, how do I get my students talking more about climate change on a day-to-day basis? Because I think that's also an important part of the solution is talking about it on a regular basis and normalizing it and then talking about how, what we can do to tackle the problem. But yeah, that's the best place for data on that kind of information, for sure.
Anyone else?
Oh yeah, still have time.
Hello, Dr. Xu. Last year, our students were fortunate enough to hear you give a similar conversation when you Skyped in with the Scholars of Global
Oh,
Distinction.
great.
So thank you so much.
Yeah.
You've got some fans here. I have a question about your advocacy piece, because most of the time we think of scientists delving deeply and understanding the problem, but as you've noted, if you cannot change it into policy and action, we really stay stuck. So for students who are researching, how can they raise awareness, or how can they find solutions that are practical, because they're not governors yet, but they can start somewhere?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So there is and I'll send you some resources, because I do teach a climate change communication unit in my climate change class. And there are a lot of resources out there. And it's tough, because you look at the data and you see that the number one problem when it comes to climate change is really governments, in my opinion, and coming from a public policy school. And so we really need to have governments set the regulatory framework, and also to provide the signals to businesses also, okay, well, this is an important issue and we need to limit our greenhouse gas emissions, and ideally there would be some sort of signal to restrict carbon, whether it's a cap on carbon emissions. Economists will say we need a price on carbon. There's lots of different opinions of how to get there. And then I think that there is a lot, particularly in the media, from these large corporations that are lobbying governments to then try to push the problem to individuals and consumers, which really, I think, are a small part of the overall problem. But what my research has shown is that in aggregate, if we individually come together and we all try to do our part in terms of reducing consumption, just eating less meat one day, telecommuting, taking one less transatlantic flight a year, then also being able to take public transit when we can. So the IPCC and the working group that I worked on, which was focused on climate change solutions, they introduced this amazing chapter, chapter 5. I always tell all my students, if there's one chapter you read in the IPCC, go and read that one, because it's incredible. And for the first time, they quantified how much in aggregate, when everybody, individuals, take their own actions on climate change, what that can amount to. And what we found is that 40 to 70% of emissions can be further reduced if people take those measures, in terms of, eating just a little bit of fewer meat. Not saying giving it up altogether, but just eating fewer meat and taking the bus and trying to be just in our daily lives. So to me, that gave some agency back, even though the number one problem is still governments and the corporations who lobby. I mentioned fossil fuel subsidies, that's a huge problem. And so, I think that that's number one. And so there are things that students can do on the local level. We've had students who have used our data and our maps, and they'll say, hey, look, we see that there are universities and there are cities and there are businesses that support climate change action based on Data-Driven Lab's data. And so they've used that data, they've written letters in their local newspapers, they've met with local policymakers to say, what are you doing? Why is there no climate action plan? How come you don't have a plan to address, I don't know if Goldsboro has a climate action plan. I can probably check my database when I get back, because we've collected all this data. But students use that data to then advocate, and also in their daily lives, they started things like meatless Mondays or veggie dinners and things like that, to try to also do what they can and try to raise awareness about public transit, or working with local transit authorities to say, hey, can we try to make bus schedules more regular or improve the apps? So I think there's a lot of things that can be done. I'm happy to share some more resources, but I think it needs to be on both levels. Like, I don't want to say, oh yeah, it's a personal problem that we all, it's all our fault, because I think that that's not true. It's definitely governments, companies, but then also what was very encouraging in this last scientific report is that we did show there's a lot of potential too when we collectively can take these actions. We can also reduce emissions on top of what government should be reducing. So I thought that was at least some, if you go to previous IPCC reports, that chapter is not in there. So that was a new chapter in the solutions in the mitigation working group. So chapter 5, I always encourage everyone to read that one. Yes, okay.
What was the impact of the Beijing Olympics on China's response to the air pollution problem?
That's a wonderful question, because I was living in Beijing right before the Olympics in 2008, and it was incredible. They did so many, some measures were not replicable, right? Like, they shut down tons of factories. That was not replicable. They couldn't just tell people you can't work. So that was one. Some of the cleanest air quality in that time period was right before the Olympics. Some of the things that they did do in terms of traffic. So they instituted an odd-even license plate rule right before the Olympics, and they kept that. They got rid of old, polluting, dirty, what they called yellow-carded vehicles. They kept that as well. And then so that was a big part. They got rid of all of the coal-fired power plants within Beijing. So the last one they retired in 2015, and that was also huge in terms of reducing air pollution. So on the traffic, they also built so many new subway lines. So the first time I went to China was in 2004. They had 3 subway lines. In 2008, I think by that time they had opened up another 5 or 6. Now they have like over 20 subway lines. And then in China, there are 42 cities that all have subway systems. In the United States, I think I can count the number of subways on one hand, right? Like Chicago, New York City, Boston, DC, San Francisco. I don't know if there's any more like on one hand. So they did a lot on public transit that really stuck, and these policies on getting rid of all the coal-fired power plants, and then like these traffic. Although traffic has since ballooned. I mean, I try not to take a car anytime I'm in Beijing because it's just so congested. But they have amazing public transit.
We have time for one more question. Anybody else?
Feel free to also email me. I'm not checking Twitter as much these days because it's kind of, since it's been X, I haven't really been as interested. But feel free to email me. I do answer email.
So one of the things you mentioned was manufacturing, that
Yes.
China is one of the leading manufacturers. What is the effect that we have when we outsource our industry to China?
Yes, so that's a really great question. I do have, in another talk, I have a map of exactly what you mean, is embodied carbon emissions. And so that's what China argues. When we go to these international negotiations, that's what they argue. They say the products that we're producing are exported to Europe and the United States. And so that's why they've been talking about border adjustment taxes, so actually levying a tax on the carbon that's embodied in these products because they're not necessarily being consumed in China. They're being produced in China, but then being exported and consumed in the West. So that's exactly the argument that Chinese negotiators would take to these talks. They would say, well, this is unfair because you guys are consuming. This is driven by your demand. And it's absolutely true. This amazing paper by Steve Smith, he was at UC Davis for a number of years, but yeah, you can see these huge arrows of just the embodied carbon flows. So yeah, that's a huge, huge argument. And so also that's an argument that they've made. They say, okay, well, if you want to restrict our carbon emissions and these products are going to become more costly. And certainly we have seen that with labor standards and cost of labor also going up. So a lot of this manufacturing, unfortunately, this is what we talk about in terms of carbon leakage. That's going to other parts of Southeast Asia, to Latin America, to Africa. And so I think that's why it's so important that globally we set this overall framework for net zero and decarbonization so that countries, as they're planning, as they're decarbonizing, they don't have to follow the same path that the United States or Europe has followed. They can leapfrog and start to adopt some of these technologies early on that can help the world avoid a much more carbon-intensive development pathway. So, but yeah, that's absolutely a really, really important point, and that China has said over and over again. They said, this is due to the West consumption, so how can you blame us? And yeah, this idea of these border adjustment taxes, that's also being hotly discussed in the United States context as well.
Dr. Hsu, that was fabulous.
Great,
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much for educating us and enlightening us.
Thank you.
That was fabulous. And we hope we'll see you next week. Remember, it's on Tuesday night, and it's at 5:30, same time, but at the different location. The talk on artificial intelligence will be in Walnut 101. We hope to see you there. Have a good evening.